In less than 48 hours, one bold move out of Ouagadougou shut down the largest synthetic drug network the Sahel has ever seen. Over 10 tons of so-called agricultural supplies, in reality high-purity meth worth tens of millions, on European streets. And it wasn't the work of some global task force. It came from a nation the West has often called too small to stand on its own. But the shock wasn't just in the size of the bust. It was in what happened next. A sovereign African government sealed an entire strategic border without asking permission from any outside power, breaking decades of diplomatic habit in a single order. And buried inside this story is a question most people are not ready to ask out loud. Are those aid channels we've been told to trust really as clean as they claim? If you're watching from New York, Houston, Los Angeles, or anywhere else, drop a comment. Where are you right now? And have you ever had to choose between playing it safe and trusting the system? You might be surprised how similar that choice feels, whether you're in the US or in West Africa. This is Africa Daily. Good news. Bringing you the side of Africa's story that most networks skip. The side that connects power, economics, and security across continents. If you're new here, hit subscribe so you don't miss the perspectives the mainstream often leaves out. And to see how it all began, we go back to the moment when a quiet West African night was interrupted by a signal no one expected. At 2:12 a.m., something broke the pattern, an encrypted ping into Burkina Faso's regional command warning of a convoy with no plates, no transponders, gliding through northern corridors as if rules didn't exist. Aid logos on the doors, midnight timing on the clock. That combination doesn't belong together. Command pulled satellite heat and infrared. The manifest said seed grain and fertilizer. The scanners said steady interior heat. Wrong for seed, wrong for any ambient cargo at that hour. If the paperwork is clean but the physics is off, which one do you trust? Most Americans, when faced with mixed signals, default to the document over the gut. Training and liability push in that direction. But borders don't run on theory, they run on behavior. Intel traced the convoy to a decommissioned petroleum route, officially low risk since foreign operations scaled down. Low risk on paper, high confidence in motion. That was the paradox. According to field officers, trucks using abandoned corridors tend to move either because they must or because they assume someone cleared the way. The team built a live overlay, historic NGO traffic, commercial freight rhythms, old fuel lanes. The convoy matched none of the normal patterns and too many of the exceptions. Traoré faced a hard trade. Intercept early and risk a diplomatic incident with humanitarian branding on camera, or shadow the route, gather proof, and be ready the second sovereignty applies. Choose A, you get a headline first and evidence later. Choose B, you get evidence first and a headline that can withstand pressure. He chose B. The order was simple, track, not touch, until the borderline made the decision legally clean. For 14 hours, the feeds told a quiet story. Stop points were short, radio chatter was minimal, drivers kept a steady speed like they'd rehearsed. No escorts, yet no fear. No plates, yet no hurry. That confidence unsettled the room more than any threat report. If people can move like they own the road, they usually know something the checkpoint doesn't. There's a human angle to nights like this. Before, when outside liaisons set the pace, local officers often waited for green lights that arrived late or not at all. After, when the center of gravity shifts home, decisions compress, hesitation drops, and accountability moves closer to the badge. According to field training research and decades of patrol culture, when authority sits nearer, compliance rises and blame-shifting falls. It's not romantic, it's operational. So the convoy rolled south, and the map of the Sahel felt smaller, tighter, more readable. The team kept eyes on the heat signatures, the gaps between trucks, the timing of every turn. The question for you, wherever you're watching from, Chicago, Phoenix, Miami, is simple. When systems stall, would you rather your city hold the line and risk the noise, or wait for permission and risk the loss? There isn't a perfect answer, only a cost curve. At 6:03 a.m., the lead truck crossed into Burkina Faso. The legal threshold flipped from caution to action. Radios clicked, protocols stacked into place. The night had been about restraint. The morning would test what restraint had earned. Aid logos on trucks, no plates, a midnight run down a decommissioned fuel corridor. That mix doesn't happen by accident. If a convoy looks like charity but moves like contraband, something's inverted. The route was the tell. Instead of the standard humanitarian lanes, the drivers chose an old petroleum track labeled low risk after foreign forces drew down. Low risk on the map, high confidence on the ground. The markings on the doors resembled European NGOs, names once active, some dissolved, some rebranded. Paperwork cited seed grain and lime for soil recovery. Thermal scans didn't agree. Seeds don't hold a steady core temperature at 2 a.m. Chemical mass does. Command overlaid 3 datasets: historic NGO corridors, commercial freight rhythms, and the petroleum grid that used to feed forward operating bases. The convoy didn't fit the first 2. It hugged the third. According to border analysts, when actors avoid staffed checkpoints but keep a metronome-stable speed, they're not hiding from patrols, they're counting on being waved through. And that's the uncomfortable part in any system labels by time. Most Americans, faced with a truck wearing the right brand at a bad hour, default to the label. Liability culture trains that reflex. Driver behavior matched rehearsal, tight spacing, synchronized stops, radio silence. A defunct medical distributor listed years ago in Niger popped up in the digital trail. Agro-Sahel-style stationery appeared in fragments. Enough to borrow legitimacy, not enough to prove authorship. It looked less like relief and more like camouflage. If people can, they choose the path of least friction. If networks can, they choose the path of least questions. This route had both. There was a human shift inside the command room too. Before, calls to outside liaisons would stall decisions. After, with tools built at home and help from regional analysts, timelines compressed. You could feel the posture change from wait and ask to watch and act. The risk calculus was simple, not easy. Intercept early and risk humiliating an honest partner on camera. Shadow to the line and risk losing the cargo. Choose early, you might win the headline and lose the case. Choose the line, you trade noise for proof. Proof travels further than outrage. Wherever you're watching from, Boston, Phoenix, Oakland, ask yourself, if a convoy with charity logos rolled through your city at midnight, would you want officers to trust the stamp or the physics? Not a rhetorical question. It's the same dilemma at ports, highways, and airports every day. For viewers new here, hit like if you want more reporting that follows evidence over spin. It helps this reach people who usually see the headline, not the breakdown. Then listen to the clock in this story. Spacing, speed, heat, all pointing the same direction. The trucks kept the abandoned fuel road until the border itself redrew the rules. And when steel met the painted line at first light, the next move would not be a request. It would be an order, one that would make phones ring far beyond West Africa and turn a quiet night into a test of sovereignty. At 6:03 a.m., the map changed. One order turned a flowing multinational corridor into a hard stop. 6 hours, all crossings sealed, civilian lanes and aid lanes alike, no exceptions. The corridor wasn't closed for weather or war. It was closed for proof. The directive moved fast. 12 outposts received it, 11 satellite relays carried it, and a routine morning became a legal wall. For the first time in recent West African practice, a sovereign government shut a strategic route without clearing it through outside liaisons. Phones lit up from Paris, Brussels, New York. The line stayed one way. French security advisors asked for status. EU development officials sent urgent flags. UN monitors pinged for clarification. None of that changed the posture on the ground. Inside the command center, the human shift was obvious. Before the order, eyes bounced between protocols and possibilities. After the order, postures straightened, voices dropped, tasks narrowed. People move differently when responsibility sits closer. In the US, most professionals default to process until a clock forces a decision. The same instinct lives at borders. Confronted with risk, humans pick the arena they control. Here, control meant time and space. Own the hours, own the lanes. There was a price table either way. Keep the border open and preserve diplomatic comfort. Close it and accept the headlines. Option 1 risks losing evidence to politeness fatigue. Option 2 risks noise but buys a clean chain of custody. Evidence travels farther than apologies. Officers on shift knew what came with that trade. Fewer handshakes, more scrutiny. Higher odds the case survives a press cycle. The trucks kept moving toward the line as if this were another morning. It wasn't. The legal threshold flipped the moment steel crossed paint. On camera, the optics are stark. Aid logos frozen behind barriers, but optics don't test cargo. Physics and paperwork had been disagreeing all night. The order forced them into the same room. The border didn't just keep things out, it kept interference out. If you've ever watched a storm approach your city, Miami, Denver, Seattle, you know the feeling. You clear the schedule and tighten the windows before the first drop falls. That's what 6 hours did here. It bought stillness. It bought sequence. It bought the right to act without asking to act. Outside, the sun edged up on a quiet road. Inside, screens brightened and the work changed shape, from waiting on permission to reading patterns in real time. The next move wouldn't come from a distant desk. It would come from the tools at hand and the people who built them. The call didn't go to a foreign fusion center. It went down the hall. Banks of local servers spun up, Ghanaian forensics on a secure line, and an upgraded command in Ouagadougou took the lead. No permission slip, no handoff, just tools built at home doing a job others said required outside supervision. Here's the news first. AI pathing models and terrain adaptive heat maps rebuilt the convoy's footprint in near real time. Analysts overlaid commercial freight rhythms against historical NGO traffic and the old petroleum grid. Every detour, every checkpoint delay, every unscheduled pause was logged into a digital reconstruction. The outcome was blunt. 3 previous convoys had traced roughly the same route, about 89% overlap, none with clean manifests, all slipping into the Sahel without inspection. If the lane looked routine from the road, the data read privileged access. The numbers didn't move alone. Human behavior stitched the picture. Steady speed like rehearsal, synchronized stops that avoided staffed posts, radio silence where chatter is normal. According to border operations research and long policing habit, when actors choose abandoned corridors and keep tempo, they're not hiding from law. They're assuming immunity from it. Most Americans know a version of this from airports and ports. Labels accelerate clearance. But when the physics conflict with the paperwork, trust has to relocate. Inside the room, posture changed. Weeks earlier, the same analysts would have waited. Send a memo, copy a liaison, build consensus. Now the code sat on their desk, the model answered to their clock, and accountability had a local address. That's a universal shift. When expertise is proximate, hesitation drops, ownership rises. People don't become reckless, they become precise. Distance makes caution a policy. Proximity makes clarity a practice. There was a choice architecture underneath all of it. Outsource capability and borrow speed, or own the stack and buy scrutiny. You can rent authority, but you can't rent responsibility. In a US city desk or a West African command, the trade never really changes. Maps are not neutral when they're fed the right questions. They push back. A quiet question for you. In your town, Cleveland, San Diego, Charlotte, would you rather a polished outside report tomorrow or a rough but accountable local picture tonight? Most people don't decide that out loud, but systems do, and their outcomes look different on the ground. By sunrise, the overlays tightened to a few high-probability hot zones, the kind you can brief in one sentence and act on without theatrics. The screens stopped telling a mystery and started pointing to a door. And out on the road, one stretch of asphalt, one set of containers, would soon have to answer to the same physics that exposed them. At 7:46 p.m., just outside Gorom, the heat signature on Truck 2 stopped being a theory and turned into a target. A fixed-wing drone held altitude. Ground teams moved in. The lane went quiet. Aid labels on the doors, core temps like a kiln. That contradiction doesn't survive contact. News first. Extraction ran under 20 minutes. No chase, no shots, no injuries. Containers marked agricultural lime were isolated, photographed, and opened with cryocutters. Inside, tightly cast crystal slabs, high-purity synthetic methamphetamine. Preliminary estimates put the European street value near $90 million. Chain of custody was locked from the first cut. Body cams rolling, time-stamped stills, sample kits sealed on site, serials read aloud. Paperwork can be forged. Temperature and mass don't lie. The storytelling is in the room. Gloves on, radios low. Everyone speaking in half sentences because the facts were loud enough. Before nights like this, officers were trained to wait for approvals. After a month of running their own stack, the posture changed. Slower hands, faster decisions, fewer glances at the door. People everywhere do the same thing when stakes are real. They narrow their focus and make the next correct move. According to patrol psychology and decades of shift work, proximity to accountability reduces hesitation. You could feel it. Less theater, more procedure. Back to the record. The profiles of the slabs matched lab-purified stock rather than cottage production. Packaging density was inconsistent with soil amendments. Load distribution suggested deliberate heat management. Field Chem confirmed the class. Purity readouts will take lab time, but the curve looked wrong for anything agricultural. Labels said recovery, metrics said revenue. The convoy had moved like it had friends at every turn. Tonight, it had none. There was a choice on the gravel shoulder. Open everything on camera immediately or secure in sequence for admissibility. Intercept early for spectacle or move methodically for a case that survives a week of headlines. Most Americans, when weighing safety versus optics, will pick the thing that keeps their street quiet by morning. That's what happened here. Quiet first, spectacle never. One more detail unsettled the perimeter. Two unregistered eyes circled high above the site, flying like they belonged. Not hobbycraft, flight pattern and signature looked commercial military. They didn't change the timeline. They did change the temperature in the room. When networks watch from above, they're not guessing. They're checking on an investment. Wherever you're watching from, Cincinnati, Portland, San Antonio, ask yourself, if your city had to pick between a loud raid that crumbles in court or a calm search that sticks, which outcome would you rather live with tomorrow morning? If this kind of on-the-ground breakdown matters to you, share this with one person who follows world news. It helps serious reporting outrun the noise. And as the lids closed and the samples moved to cold storage, the story shifted from metal and crystal to something harder to contain. Documents, codes, and a trail that didn't end on that road. The QR codes didn't lead to farms, they led to labs. Shipments labeled seed aid mapped to research compounds on Europe's coast, not to depots that handle grain or lime. News first. The Ghanaian tech unit cross-referenced the codes with port logs from 2023. Entries in Lagos and Cotonou showed cargo streams that never received full inspection, yet carried the same consignee names and destination coordinates now tied to the convoy. Approvals were stamped under a post-conflict agro-restoration fast-track, useful for speed, except no ministry inside ECOWAS could find its own endorsement trail. Aid paperwork without an aid sponsor is not a clerical error, it's a design. A private audit firm in Antwerp appeared as the validator. Its work on paper traveled through 3 subcontracted logistics shells, each one just solid enough to pass a glance, not a probe. Then the center of the web surfaced on physical tape and seals. Agri-Development West Africa. Registration checks pointed to an anonymous office suite in Luxembourg. No published staff list, no working phone, a website under masking services. Financial pulls showed funding lines brushing a pharmaceutical conglomerate previously investigated for exporting precursor chemicals outside control protocols. If the front says relief but the money smells of synthesis, you believe the money. Inside the room, the change was human and immediate. Before, officers would have chased signatures. After weeks of running their own stack, they chased behavior. Most Americans know the reflex. Clean invoices calm the mind. But when the physics say heat and the routing says privilege, the category loses its shelter. According to observation across policing and compliance work, People hide inside labels when they can. Systems hide inside exemptions when they're allowed. There was a fork in the road. Treat this as a paperwork dispute and get dragged into procedural fog. Treat it as a criminal timetable and move while the timeline is still yours. Choose the first, and you keep friends in the inbox. Choose the second, and you keep proof in your hands. The trail wasn't complicated. It was compartmentalized on purpose. That's how corridors stay open without questions. Long enough for a shipment to become a story no one can unwind. Quiet question for viewers in Tampa, St. Louis, or Queens. When a label and a pattern disagree, which one would you want your city to trust at 3 a.m., the stamp or the signal? By late morning, the files were stacked, the coordinates aligned, and the narrative was no longer a rumor on a dusty road. It was a dossier with a return address. The next decision wouldn't be about a truck. It would be about what to do with a truth that doesn't fit inside a sealed envelope. The files didn't go behind a door. They went live. Shipping seals, QR matches, heat overlays, custody logs released in full, not summarized. Publish, not negotiate. News first. Requests for confidential dialogue landed from European desks. Liaison pings stacked from development offices. Monitors asked for status. The response was the same. Evidence stays public. Independent verifiers in Kenya, Ghana, and South Africa cross-checked documents and metadata. A regional transparency forum issued support for disclosure. Statements of procedural concern arrived from abroad. They didn't slow the timeline. Headlines moved faster than facts. Overseas outlets framed a standoff over aid cargo, careful with words, quiet on purity levels and thermal signatures. Inside the command room, the human shift was visible. Before, officers braced for calls. After, they braced the case. People everywhere do the same thing when proof is on the table. Posture straightens, speech shortens, work narrows. Most Americans, by habit, skim the headline first. According to media use research and common newsroom practice, documents trail in clicks. But when primary files are accessible and verifiable, trust recalibrates. If the banner says relief but the lab says meth, you believe the lab. On the continent, the tone changed by the hour. Ghana's leadership affirmed a sovereign right to inspect cargo. In Bamako, the language was plainer, praise for a move others avoided. Nigeria flagged multinational exploitation under humanitarian cover as a legitimate security risk. Algeria and Chad signaled legal help to check historical entry points. These weren't fringe voices. They were capitals drawing lines. The story stopped being a border incident and started reading like a test case for how Africa handles its own corridors. There was a universal choice architecture at work. Keep the evidence sealed and preserve diplomatic comfort, or open it and accept the noise. Choose sealed, and confusion spreads faster than truth. Choose open, and the narrative fights you on day 1, but runs out of room by day 3. Humans, if they can, prefer the path with fewer immediate arguments. Systems, if allowed, prefer the path with fewer permanent records. Transparency flips both preferences. Quiet question for viewers in Raleigh, Detroit, or Fresno. When your city sees a headline that softens a hard fact, would you rather officials defend their inbox or their exhibits? By night's end, the document dump had done its job. The dispute looked less like a misunderstanding and more like a map with names on it. And when morning cut through the glass of the command center, the response would stop living on screens and start living at the lanes where cargo meets light. By sunrise, the response stopped being a statement and became infrastructure. Burkina Faso announced Operation Sahara Sands, Clean Corridor, effective immediately. 11 key crossings across the Sahel were slated for permanent high-resolution scanning posts. Mobile adaptive units could probe commercial tanks and insulated NGO cargo. Every load would be inspected, logo or not. Interpol signed a 5-year data-sharing protocol that added West Africa's humanitarian lanes to its high-risk narcotics index for the first time in years. The corridor that once relied on trust now ran on verification. Capitals moved. Nigeria's Interior Ministry convened an emergency security caucus. Algeria and Chad sent legal teams to audit historical entry points. Delegations flew into Ouagadougou. A joint plan, AfricaNet Clean Transit, proposed synchronized customs data, scan signatures, and GPS trails for all development cargo. Think of it as a digital firewall for a continent-wide highway. ECOWAS, in an extraordinary budget session, approved supplemental funding to police buffer zones. Mauritania pledged drone logistics. Benin opened airspace. Niger offered satellite uplinks from decommissioned towers. What used to be a patchwork became a mesh. The facts kept stacking. Seized compounds labeled anti-pest liquid tracked as methylamine precursors with purity above European industrial norms. Labs in Gorom and Dori were upgraded to deliver preliminary reads in under 90 minutes, with secure feeds to partner states. Customs teams embedded agronomy experts to check seed aid claims on the spot. Labels lost their shelter the moment science entered the lane. And then the human shift, small but visible. Before, officers waited for green lights that lived in someone else's inbox. After, the checklist lived in their hands. Training changed posture. Fewer gestures to the door, more eyes on the readouts. According to long-running patrol studies and everyday workplace habit, when authority sits closer, hesitation drops and ownership rises. Most Americans recognize the rhythm from their own cities. If the rule is clear and the tool works, people comply. When rules blur and tools lag, cynicism spikes. That's the universal math at borders too. There was a real cost curve under the headline. Keep exemption zones, and you save minutes but lose months to clean up. Close the blind spots, and you pay minutes now to save lives later. If your town, Buffalo, Sacramento, Tulsa, had to pick, which timeline would you want your family living inside? Not a trick question. It's the same trade wherever freight meets authority. None of this was theater. Scanners went up. Protocols went live. A separate convoy flagged at the Tambao corridor tested reforestation material with a chemical profile that didn't belong in a forest. The difference this time wasn't outrage, it was process. When corridors change from promises to procedures, exploitation loses the oxygen of ambiguity. By evening, trucks that once moved like they owned the road rolled slower. The sun dropped on border lanes that no longer blinked, on officers who no longer waited to be told they could act. And as the last monitor dimmed in the command center, the story narrowed to one quiet image: cargo meeting light and a region deciding what it will and won't allow, setting the stage for what this moment truly means beyond one operation, beyond 1 week, beyond one leader. 48 hours of action rewrote years of expectation. A single operation turned a low-risk corridor into a case study for how quickly control can shift when authority lives at home. The bust wasn't just measured in kilos seized, but in habits broken. Factually, the numbers stand. 10 tons of synthetic meth pulled from containers marked as aid. 3 prior convoys traced with near-identical routes, all previously untouched. Multiple states moving to close inspection gaps, and a regional protocol now tracking humanitarian shipments with the same intensity as high-threat narcotics. The changes didn't come from an external task force. They came from inside the map. The human side is harder to log. Before, border teams stood by for calls from far-off desks. After, they worked to checklists they could touch. Most Americans have lived a version of that shift, waiting for approval that never comes fast enough, then seeing what happens when the power to decide sits in the same room. Distance keeps the rules safe. Proximity keeps the rules alive. There was a cost table behind every choice. Keep playing by inherited protocols, and Africa would keep lanes open for exploitation. Break the pattern and risk friction with partners who prefer quiet lanes. Choosing A meant fewer headlines now, but more funerals later. Choosing B meant headlines now and a cleaner map later. Systems in every country face that same fork. For those watching from Dallas, Minneapolis, or Newark, the lesson isn't bound to West Africa. If your city's safety depended on closing a gap that outsiders wanted open, would you wait for consensus or act on what you already know? As the Sahel cooled under nightfall, the lanes stayed lit. Scanners hummed, data links held, and officers stepped into shifts knowing the work had changed. One flare in the dark doesn't light a continent, but it can mark where the ground stops giving way.